is a life worth? It depends really who you're talking to. If you're talking to the American government after World War II, they would say if you built machines of death, you were worth keeping, and if not, you were executed. Let's talk about the aggregate 4, though you probably know it by its much more ominous marketing term, the V-2 rocket. Historically, we were taught to view this as the grandfather of modern space exploration, the sleek black and white checkered ancestor to the Saturn V. But if you actually look at the ledger, the V-2 wasn't a triumph of engineering, it was a mathematical anomaly of human suffering. Here's the brutal, cold-blooded statistic that military historians usually gloss over. More people died building the V-2 than were actually killed by its detonation. It is estimated that between 12,000 and 20,000 slave laborers perished in the subterranean hellscape of the Mittelwerk factory, located inside the Kolnstein mountain. They died from starvation, exhaustion, and dysentery while assembling those miracle weapons. Meanwhile, the actual deployment of the V-2 against targets like London, Antwerp, and Liège resulted in approximately only 9,000 civilian and military deaths. Mathematically speaking, the weapon was significantly more efficient at killing its own manufacturing force than it was at hitting its targets. It was a weapon of mass destruction that turned inward. So in a move that shocked no one, the architects of this system, men who walked through those tunnels past piles of emaciated bodies, didn't end up on the gallows in Nuremberg. Instead, they ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, drinking sweet tea and getting invited to the White House. Take Wernher von Braun. If you look at archival footage from the 1950s, you'll see a charismatic, square-jawed visionary appearing on the Disney's Man in Space special. Explaining the wonders of orbital mechanics to a captivated American public, he was the quintessential good scientist. But if you rewind the tape just 10 years, the scenery changes. Instead of Tomorrowland, you have Mittelbau-Dora, a concentration camp where prisoners lived in damp, lightless tunnels, breathing in rock dust and jet fuel fumes. Von Braun wasn't just a bystander, he was a technical director who frequently visited these tunnels to inspect the workforce. The subversion of reality here is staggering. We were told the space race was a giant leap for mankind, a noble pursuit of the stars. In reality, it was a high-stakes international shell game. It was a giant get-out-of-jail-free card issued to the elite scientific cadre of the Third Reich. The mechanics of this moral bankruptcy were managed by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA. They realized early on that the German lead in rocketry, particularly the use of liquid oxygen and ethanol propellants, and the advanced gyroscopic guidance systems, was decades ahead of anything the Allies had. The US military didn't want justice, they wanted the telemetry data. Naturally, their solution was to print more money, specifically to fund a massive recruitment drive called Operation Paperclip. The name wasn't accidental. It referred to the physical paperclips attached to the personnel files of scientists whose Nazi records were too loud to pass through the State Department. A paperclip meant scrub the SS rank, ignore the membership in the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This guy knows how to make a rocket go Mach 5, so his resume is now clean. This leads us to a rather uncomfortable rhetorical question. How many war crimes are we willing to forgive for a seat at the lunar table? Apparently the answer is exactly 1,600. That is the approximate number of German scientists, engineers, and technicians who were moved to the US. Many of whom were granted citizenship and high-level security clearances, while the ink on the Nuremberg indictments was still wet. The Axis powers were gone, but the dictatorial mindset of the ends justifying the means simply changed uniforms. The US government looked at the 20,000 dead laborers in the Kolnstein mountain and decided that their deaths were an acceptable sunk cost if it meant beating the Soviets to the moon. Von Braun famously joked that his rockets worked perfectly except for the fact that they landed on the wrong planet. It's a witty bit of dry humor, provided you ignore the fact that the rockets he's talking about were aimed at civilian apartment blocks in London. To the American military, the fact that he kept hitting London instead of a military base wasn't a moral failing, it was just a minor resume gap in the pursuit of intercontinental ballistic missile capability. The stakes here weren't just about who got to plant a flag in the lunar dust, it was about the total collapse of the post-war moral high ground. By importing the brains behind the V-2, the United States effectively signaled that ethics are the luxury of the winner of small wars, but for the great power competition, usefulness is the only currency that matters. We didn't just win the space race, we bought the winning team from the losers, and we used the paperclip to hide the receipt. To understand how we ended up with the SS officers designing American suburbs in spacesuits, we have to look at the original sin of the late war period. The terrifying realization in 1944 that the master race was in several specific ways actually ahead. As the Allies clawed their way across Western Europe, they weren't just finding abandoned bunkers, They were finding technology that made their own gear look like it belonged in a museum. We're talking about the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter, which could outpace the best Allied P-51 Mustangs by over 100 miles an hour. We're talking about sarin and tabun, nerve agents that the US and UK didn't even have a name for yet, let alone a defense against. And of course, the A-4 or the V-2 rocket, which was essentially a high-delivery service for explosives that traveled at supersonic speeds. The moment the realization hit that Germany had mastered the physics of the future while the rest of us were still perfecting the tank, the moral compass of the Allied High Command didn't just spin, it shattered. Justice was suddenly a secondary concern, and the new mission was a desperate, panicked grab for blueprints. The US and the USSR realized that the post-war world wasn't going to be defined by who held the most territory, but by who held the most patents. So, the quest for retribution was quietly backburned in favor of a frantic scavenger hunt. This brings us to one of the most absurdly pivotal moments in intelligence history, the discovery of the Osenberg List. In March 1945, a Polish lab technician at Bonn University found a stuffed toilet. This wasn't just a plumbing issue, it was a gold mine. Inside were the partially destroyed remains of a list compiled by Werner Osenberg, the head of a very long name which I'm going to try to pronounce, but forgive me, Wursforschungsgemeinschaft, which translates to the Defense Research Association. Osenberg has been tasked with identifying and recalling indispensable scientists from the front lines, men who were too smart to be wasted in a trench in Russia. The Americans fished this soggy list out of the pipes, dried it off, and realized that they had the literal grocery list for the Third Reich's intellectual elite. It contained thousands of names, physicians, chemists, engineers, and aerodynamicists. This wasn't just data, it was the roster for the next century of military dominance. Initially, Franklin D. Roosevelt had issued a fairly clear directive: no ardent Nazis, or those with a history of war crimes were to be recruited. It was a nice sentiment, the kind of thing that looks great on a press release. But by the time Harry Truman took the wheel, the cold reality of the brewing conflict with the Soviet Union had set in. The military knew that if they followed the law, the best minds on the Osenberg List would end up in a gulag in Siberia building rockets for Stalin. To prevent this, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was formed. The purpose of the JIOA was to bypass the very laws they were supposed to uphold. They were the ones who realized that the total war had inevitably transitioned into total talent scouting. The mechanics of this pivot were as cynical as they were efficient. The JIOA began a process of pre-screening, which is a polite intelligence term for sanitizing. If a scientist like Arthur Rudolph was later linked to the horrific conditions of the Mittelwerk factory, he was deemed scientifically indispensable. The JIOA simply made sure that his ardent Nazi status was reclassified as nominal participation. They were essentially editing a history of the war in real time to fit the needs of the future. It's almost impressive, in a dark way. The same guys who were firebombing German cities 6 months earlier were now frantically trying to make sure the guys who designed the bombs didn't get a scratch on them. And to no one's surprise, the dictatorial efficiency of the German scientific machine was deemed too useful to dismantle. The Allies didn't want to destroy the Nazi war machine, they wanted to strip it for parts and install the engine in their own vehicle. By the late 1945, the intelligence vacuum was being filled by a stream of men in oversized suits carrying slide rules, all of whom shared a very specific, very convenient collective amnesia about what they had been doing between 1933 and 1945. The original sin of the Cold War wasn't just the division of Berlin, it was the decision that a PhD in aerodynamics was a valid substitute for a clear conscience. Next time you see a picture of 1940s American lab, look at the guys in the back row. Chances are they were on the Osenberg List. They were only there because someone in the JIOA decided that a paperclip was more powerful than a war crimes tribunal. If you want to understand the true currency of the post-war era, you need to stop looking at gold bars and start looking at gray matter. By 1945, the traditional spoils of war, land, bullion, and art were essentially secondary. The real resource was the one that made the Joint Chief of Staff salivate, and it was intellectual property. In the ruins of the Reich, a German physicist specializing in supersonic wind tunnels or the infrared vampire night vision scopes was worth significantly more than his weight in Nazi gold. Gold is finite, you spend it, and it's gone. But a scientist who understands the fluid dynamics of a swept-wing jet, like the Horten Ho 229 Flying Wing, is a gift that keeps on giving. He represents a perpetual motion machine of military advantage. The United States government didn't just stumble into this realization, they codified it. They viewed the seizure of these men not as human right violations or a legal gray area, but as intellectual reparations. The logic was simple. If entirely devoid of a moral pulse, Germany had caused billions of dollars in destruction and cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Since Germany was essentially bankrupt and its infrastructure was a pile of smoking bricks, The US decided to collect on that debt by strip mining the German Brain Trust. This was the ultimate debt collection agency. If we couldn't get cash, we'd take the guy who figured out how to make G7 acoustic homing torpedoes, and we'd take the chemist who developed taboo nerve gas at the IG Farben plants. It was a cold transactional accounting of the war's cost. We weren't liberating these scientists, we were foreclosing on them. So, the US military began treating these recruits like high-value assets rather than war criminals. But there was a massive technical limitation to this plan: the ticking clock of the Red Scare. You see, the Americans weren't the only ones with a shopping list. The Soviet Union had launched Operation Paperclip, which essentially was the same program but with more midnight kidnappings and fewer voluntary contracts. Every day, a high-level engineer sat in an Allied denazification camp, answering pesky questions about why they joined the SS or how many prisoners died in their factories. Was a day the Soviets could swoop in. The Soviets were offering a very simple, very tempting deal. Work for us and we won't send you to a gulag. Plus, we'll let you keep your head. The US, in a desperate attempt to outbid Moscow, had to move faster. The JIOA realized that the denazification process was an annoying bureaucratic hurdle that was getting in the way of progress. If a scientist was stuck in a holding cell in Garchmitch-Partenkirchen, he wasn't designing the next generation of American interceptors. Their solution was to allocate massive classified budgets to ensure that these scientists were whisked away to the US before the Soviets could make their counteroffer. It became a high-stakes geopolitical version of a fantasy football draft. The JLA scouts were held on the field, evaluating talent, checking stats, and ignoring locker room issues, just like the fact that Canada helped run a slave labor camp. It wasn't exactly like a draft, just with more swastikas and significantly fewer ethics. If a guy could deliver a stable rocket engine, the US was willing to overlook a few unfortunate affiliations in his past. The pressure was immense. The US military was terrified that the brain drain would flow east. This led to the collapse of the Potsdam Agreement spirit, which was supposed to see the Allies working together to demilitarize Germany. Instead, the patronage network took over. If you were a scientist with the right skills, you didn't go to trial. You got a handler, a fat contract, and a one-way ticket to Wright Field in Ohio or Fort Bliss in Texas. The American military-industrial complex looked at the way the Reich had integrated science and warfare and decided that actually, this was a pretty good model. They didn't want to destroy the machine, they just wanted to change the oil and put an American flag on the hood. The economic engine of Paperclip wasn't just about winning the war that was already over. It was about financing the next one. We bought the expertise to build the Cold War on the backs of men who had built the Second World War. The debt was settled, the intellectual reparations were paid in full, and all it cost us was our remaining shred of moral credibility. The primary players were predictably the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were running which was less of a recruitment drive and more of a mass kidnapping. On October 22, 1946, the NKVD literally rounded up over 2,000 German specialists at gunpoint, packed them on the trains, and told them that their new laboratory was in the motherland. It was blunt, effective, and lacked any pretense of consent. But the US wasn't the only Western power with a shopping list. The British were running Operation Surgeon to snag Luftwaffe aerodynamics experts, and the French were window shopping for anyone who would help them rebuild their decimated industrial base. However, the United Kingdom and France were essentially broke. The US had the deepest pockets and the most enticing carrot: American citizenship and a quiet life in a country that hadn't been turned into a gravel pit. Naturally, they used their leverage and their vast economic superiority to outbid the world for the men who had spent the last decade trying to destroy them. This brings us to the paperclip magic trick. It is one of those historical details that sounds so stupid to be true, yet it defined the moral landscape of the 20th century. The State Department was, at least on paper, still trying to block the entry of ardent Nazis. They had files, deep thick dossiers filled with evidence of SS memberships and party affiliations and proximity to war crimes. If a file was marked with a red X or a negative report from the denazification boards, the scientist was supposed to be radioactive. The JIOA found a remarkably low-tech workaround. They didn't rewrite the files. That'd be too much paperwork. Instead, they simply took a standard, silver-covered paperclip and attached it to the dossiers of the indispensable ones. That paperclip was a silent signal to the visa processing officers: ignore everything in this folder, this guy is one of ours now. It was an administrative shell game. With the flick of a wrist and a piece of a bent wire, an SS member was magically transformed into a victim of Nazi coercion. In a move that shocked no one, the paperclip was sanitized. They admitted things like overseeing slave labor or attending meetings with Himmler, and they turned the architects of the Holocaust into apolitical technicians who were just following the science. It's a fascinating bit of irony. A simple piece of office stationery did more to defeat the spirit of the Nuremberg trials than any high-priced defense attorney ever could. If you have the right office supplies, apparently justice is negotiable. Let's talk about the Mittelwerk. While the American military was busy clipping files, they were knowingly absorbing the leadership of a facility that was, for all intents and purposes, a slaughterhouse. At the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, over 60,000 prisoners were forced into tunnels to build the V2. The conditions weren't just bad, they were designed to be terminal. Prisoners lived in the dark, sleeping on stone floors and tunnels filled with the dust of the Kolstein mountain. If they didn't die of tuberculosis or malnutrition, they were executed for sabotage if a rocket component failed a quality check. These 60,000 lives were the overhead cost for the American rocket program. Every time we celebrate the technical brilliance of the V2, we are looking at a machine that was lubricated by the blood of the people whose names the JIOA didn't bother to put on a dossier. The US military knew this. They arrived at the Mittelwerk shortly after liberation and saw the piles of bodies. They saw the gallows where prisoners were hung in the view of the assembly line, and then they sat down with the managers of that assembly line and offered them a job. And, of course, the system of using disposable people to achieve noble goals was simply rebranded under American management. The geopolitical chessboard didn't just care about 20,000 who died in those tunnels, it only cared about the 1,600 who knew how to build the tunnels. The victims were just a footnote in a budget report, while the perpetrators were given security clearances and a fresh start. Paperclip wasn't just a tool for organization, it was a gag order placed on history itself. By the late 1940s, the honeymoon phase of intellectual reparations hit a massive bureaucratic wall. This was the crisis point, the moment when the high-minded rhetoric of the post-war world collided head-on with the dirty reality of the military-industrial complex. Inside the walls of Washington, a series of specific, high-stakes battles broke out between the State Department and the War Department. On one side, you had the diplomats and the legal purists, who actually believed in the Yalta Conference protocols and the Potsdam Agreement, documents that explicitly called for the total dismantling of Nazi influence. They wanted to follow the law, and they looked at the dossiers of men like Robertus Strohhold, a doctor later linked to cold water experiments on prisoners at Dachau, and said maybe this guy shouldn't be in charge of American aerospace medicine. On the other side, you had the military, and their argument was as simple as it was cynical. Who cares if his hands are dirty if his math is right? They wanted the rockets, they wanted the Wasserfall surface-to-air missile tech, and the jet engines that could intercept Soviet bombers. To the generals, the State Department was a collection of naive obstructionists who didn't understand that the Third World War had already started. So the military simply began lying to the State Department. They established a JIOA, as we talked about before, to specifically run a shadow immigration system. And when State Department officials refused to grant visas to scientists with black profiles, for those with verified records of war crimes, the JIOA would simply lose the old file and replace it with a new sanitized version. They were gaslighting their own government to ensure that the architects of the V2 could get a social security number. The human cost of this error wasn't just measured in the depths of the Mittelbau-Dora tunnels, it is measured in the systematic erasure of the survivors' voices. While Werner von Braun was being groomed for a Saturn V rocket debut and becoming a media darling, the former slave laborers who had actually bolted those rockets together were being told to move on. In the interest of Cold War stability, their testimonies were sidelined, the narrative was being pivoted, and the war was over. The real enemy was Stalin. The dwelling on the past was seen as a lack of patriotism. It was a massive-scale gaslighting of the victims for the sake of technological progress. This led to the total collapse of the denazification process, which devolved from a grand moral purging into a dark farce. The mechanics of denazification were supposed to be rigorous. You had Frogebogen, a 131-question survey designed to ferret out your level of devotion to the Nazi party. If you were a baker in Munich who had joined the party to keep your shop open, you might find yourself banned from your profession or sentenced to hard labor. You were a little Nazi, and therefore you were expendable. However, if you were a high-ranking engineer who built the Heineken H-162 Volksjager, or specialized in the manufacturing of a Cyclone B, you also happened to know how to stabilize a combustion chamber, you got a clean hand certificate. You were whisked away to a suburban house in Huntsville, Alabama, given a government salary, and invited to the local Rotary Club. The law applied only to those who weren't useful. And then they started creating entire secret communities like the Sauerkraut Hill in Ohio, where these scientists lived in a weird protected bubble. The American taxpayer was essentially subsidizing the comfortable retirement of the SS elite under the guise of national security. The hypocrisy of the era was codified in 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a beautiful document, a testament to the New World Order, but if you look closely at the history of Operation Paperclip, it's clear that there was a hidden, unwritten asterisk at the bottom of the page that essentially said, terms and conditions may apply if you know how to build a supersonic interceptor and a more efficient nerve gas. Human rights were universal unless you had a PhD and a blueprint in the Pentagon. One of you. The crisis point wasn't just a conflict between departments. It was the moment the United States decided that morality was a luxury it could no longer afford. We traded our moral high ground for a better view of the stars, and we hired the devil to build the telescope. So here we are. We reached the end of the 20th century most successful rebranding campaign. We look back at the black and white photos of the Apollo 11 crew and see a triumph of human spirit. But if you squint at the telemetry data, you can still see the faint ghostly outlines of Aggregate 4 or the V2. The somber prediction, if you can't even call it a prediction when it already happened, is that we are currently living in a world built entirely on these compromised foundations. The DNA of Operation Paperclip isn't just buried in a desert in New Mexico, it's in your pocket. The GPS satellites that tell you where the nearest Starbucks is located, those are direct descendants of the internal guidance systems developed for the V2. The aerodynamics of the commercial jet that takes you on vacation thank the wind tunnel data liberated from the Aeronautical Research Institute in Germany. We've integrated the genius of the Third Reich so thoroughly in our infrastructure that extracting it would be more like trying to take the flour out of a baked cake. We didn't just win the war and move on, we absorbed the machinery of the loser and called it progress. From the high-altitude suits used by U-2 spy planes to the very foundations of NASA's Marshall Space Program, the legacy of Paperclip is everywhere. It is the ultimate useful precedent. So this established a permanent blueprint for American foreign policy throughout the Cold War and beyond. Operation Paperclip taught the US government a very dangerous lesson, that moral standing is a renewable resource that can be spent whenever natural interest is on the line. Once you've successfully integrated 1,600 Nazis into your high-security labs, how do you look at a dictator in South America or the Middle East in the eye and say their human rights record is a deal-breaker? Of decades, you don't. You set the stage for decades. We saw it with the support of the Contras in Nicaragua and the blind eye turned toward the Khmer Rouge when it suited geopolitical goals against Vietnam. The mechanics are always the same. If you have a skill we need, be it oil, a strategic... The mechanics are always the same. If you have a skill we need, be it oil, a strategic shipping lane, or the ability to suppress a shared enemy, your problematic past becomes a secondary concern. The JLOA's paperclip didn't just disappear, it became digital. And their solution was a global network of useful monsters, funding black sites and off-the-books operations that would make a State Department's lawyer head spin. The Nuremberg Code, which was supposed to prove unethical human experimentation, became a document we praised in public while secretly funded the CIA's Project MKUltra, which utilized the research of some of those very same paperclip scientists. We spent our moral capital to buy a faster jet and a more powerful bomb, and we've been paying interest on that debt ever since. Just remember the next time you look at the moon on a clear night and feel that sense of wonder, take a second to think about where that journey actually started. Now don't get me wrong, I am an American and I live in the United States. America is ahead for it. So, the morality of this is up to you. The view from the top is great, it's just a shame about the stairs.